I want you to imagine standing outside a window, in the dark, listening to your wife of 44 years laugh about how she's going to leave you with nothing. That was me, 10 months ago, 67 years old, standing in the flower bed outside my son-in-law's house, with my hand against the brick, listening to the woman I had loved and trusted for my entire adult life explain to another man exactly how she was going to steal everything I had ever built and put me out on the street. And she was laughing while she did it. I had just been driving by. That's the whole thing. I was on my way home from the hardware store, and my son-in-law's street was on the way, more or less, and I thought, I'll stop in, say hello to Corbin, maybe he'll want to grab a coffee. And then I turned onto his street and I saw my wife's car parked at his gate. And my wife had told me, that very morning, that she was spending the day with her sister 2 hours away. Now, I want to be honest with you about what I thought in that first moment, because it's not what turned out to be true, and the truth was worse. In that first moment, standing on the sidewalk looking at her car, my stomach dropped, because I actually thought, that my wife was having an affair with our daughter's husband. That's where my mind went. And I stood there feeling the bottom fall out of my life, and I made a decision that I could not have known, at the time, would save everything. I decided to walk up to the window instead of the door, and what I heard was not an affair. It was so much worse than an affair, and it changed my life and it changed theirs, and I'm going to tell you all of it, in order, because there are things in this story you need to hear. But before I go one step further, if you have ever been betrayed by somebody you would have trusted with your life, somebody who was counting on the fact that you'd never see it coming, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. Because this is a story about what happens when the person planning to rob you blind forgets one thing: that a man who spent 40 years building something knows exactly how to protect it. Stay with me. The part where it all comes down on them is worth the wait. Let me back up. My name is Rowan Ashby. I'm 68 years old now, and this happened last year when I was 67, and I've had a year to sit with all of it, and I'm going to tell it to you straight, including the parts where I was a fool, because a man doesn't get to 67 and get betrayed this thoroughly without having been a fool about a few things first. Let me tell you who I am, so the rest makes sense. I started with nothing. My father was a mechanic, and my mother cleaned houses, and I was the first person in my family to finish high school, let alone anything after. And when I was in my late 20s, I started a business. Commercial landscaping and grounds maintenance, the companies that keep the lawns and the trees and the grounds of office parks and corporate campuses and municipal properties. Unglamorous work. Good, honest, unglamorous work. And I built that company by hand over about 40 years, into something that employed 130 people and did work across the whole region. I'm not a rich man the way people picture rich. I never took the big salary. I paid my people well, and I put the money back into the business, and what I have to show for 40 years is a company worth a real amount of money, a paid-off house, a decent retirement account, and a life insurance policy I'd been paying into since I was 30, because I wanted to make sure that whoever I left behind would be all right. That's the pile. That's what my wife was standing in my son-in-law's living room planning to take. I want you to understand what those 40 years actually were, because it matters to how this ends. I started with a single-used truck and a push mower and one account, a small office park that took a chance on a kid with dirt under his nails. I cut those grounds myself at 5 in the morning before anybody arrived, so they'd see the work and not the boy doing it. I got a second account by underbidding and nearly going broke honoring it. I slept in that truck more than one summer night because driving home and back cost gas I didn't have. 40 years of that. 40 years of frozen mornings and payroll I made by the skin of my teeth and men I hired and trained, and kept employed through 2 recessions, because I couldn't stand the thought of a family losing a paycheck on my account. Every dollar in that pile has a cold morning behind it. That's the pile. That's what my wife was standing in my son-in-law's living room planning to take. Let me tell you about Delphine. I married Delphine when I was 23 years old, and she was 20, 44 years. We were kids. We had nothing. I mean nothing. We had a one-room apartment and a mattress on the floor, and I worked 2 jobs while I was getting the business off the ground. and she was there for all of it. That's the thing I keep coming back to. She was there for the lean years. She typed invoices. She answered the phone. When it was just me and a truck and a prayer, she was the one who told me not to quit. Or at least, that's the story I told myself for 44 years. I'm going to have to tell you a harder version of it in a minute, and it's cost me a great deal to understand it, so bear with me. There were signs, if I'd wanted to see them, and I want to be honest that I didn't want to see them. Delphine changed, somewhere in the last 10 years or so, in ways I explained away one at a time. She got interested in money in a way she never had been when we were poor. What other people had, what things cost, who was doing well. She started saying things like, "We're not getting any younger," and "What's the point of working so hard if we never enjoy it?" And I heard those as an old couple's ordinary complaints, and maybe for most couples that's all they'd have been. For us, I understand now, they were the sound of a woman doing arithmetic. I just wasn't in the equation the way I thought I was. We had one daughter, Junia. She's 38 now, and she is the light of my life and always has been, and everything I built in the end I built for her. That was always the plan in my head. I'd work, I'd build, and one day it would all be Junia's, and she'd be secure in a way I never was as a young man, and that would mean my whole life had added up to something. Junia married a man named Corbin Vale about 10 years ago. Corbin. I want to be fair here, because this is where I was a fool, and I need you to see it clearly. I liked Corbin. For 10 years, I liked Corbin. He was charming. He was attentive. He was good with Junia, or so it looked from the outside. He came to the Sunday dinners. He remembered my birthday. He asked me about the business, and he listened, and I mistook a man gathering information for a man who was interested in me. Those look identical from the outside. That's the whole trick of a certain kind of person, and I fell for it completely for a decade. And here's the piece I didn't see. The piece that makes this whole thing what it is. Corbin and my wife got along beautifully. Delphine adored him. And I thought that was wonderful. I thought, how lucky are we, that my wife and my son-in-law are so close. I would sit at the dinner table and watch the two of them laughing together in the kitchen, and I would feel warm about it. I would feel grateful. There was one evening, maybe 2 years back, that I've replayed 100 times since. Corbin got me talking about the business after dinner, about the ownership structure, about what would happen to it when I was gone, about the insurance, all of it, and I was flattered. I thought, here's a young man who wants to understand the family's affairs, who's thinking responsibly about the future. And I told him everything. I walked him through the whole picture, proud as anything, because a father-in-law wants to be asked, wants to matter to the younger man. And Delphine sat at that table and listened, and refilled his glass, and I remember she caught his eye at one point, and something passed between them, and I thought it was affection. I was handing a man the blueprint to rob me and calling it a nice family evening. I've had to forgive myself for that, slowly, because the alternative is to hate a version of yourself that only ever tried to be generous. I was watching a partnership form, and I thought it was a family. Now, let me tell you about the day. It was a Wednesday in the fall. Ordinary day. I'd gone to the hardware store in the morning to pick up some things for a fence repair, and Delphine had left early. She'd said she was driving out to see her sister Fen, who lives about 2 hours away, and that she'd be back for dinner. Nothing unusual. She saw her sister every few weeks, and I was driving home, and Corbin and Junia's neighborhood was more or less on the way, and I got it in my head to stop by. Junia would be at work. She teaches. She'd be in a classroom. But I thought Corbin might be home. He worked odd hours, and I thought I'd just say hello. That's the entire reason. There was no suspicion in me. I was a happy man driving home on a Wednesday who thought he'd go say hi to his son-in-law. And I turned onto their street, and there was Delphine's car, parked right at the gate, the car that was supposed to be 2 hours away at her sister's. I pulled over across the street, and I sat there for a minute with my heart going, because there is no good reason for your wife's car to be at your son-in-law's house when she told you she'd be somewhere else, and your daughter is at work. And like I said, the first thing I thought was the ugly, obvious thing. And I felt sick. And I got out of my car, and I meant to walk up to that door and knock and see both their faces when they answered, because I wanted to know. But something stopped me at the door, some instinct I didn't have a name for. And instead of knocking, I stepped off the porch and I went around the side of the house, quiet to the living room window, which was open a few inches at the bottom because it was a mild day. And I stood in the flower bed and I listened. And I want to tell you exactly what I heard, because I have heard it in my sleep every night for 10 months, and I will hear it until I die. The first thing I heard was my wife laughing. Not a nervous laugh, a delighted one. The laugh of somebody enjoying themselves. And then I heard her say, I'm going to give you her exact words because they're burned into me. She said, "It's basically done, Corbin. I've got the signatures, the bank documents, the transfer paperwork, the insurance. It's all handled. Give it another week and the property's in your name, and that old fool is going to be out on the road wondering what happened." That old fool. That's what she called me. Standing in another man's living room, 44 years into our marriage, laughing. And I want to be precise about what she was describing, because it took my lawyer to help me fully understand it later, but I understood the shape of it right there in that flower bed. She was telling him that she had been forging my signature, on bank documents, on property transfers, on my life insurance, that she had been, for some period of time, quietly signing my name to papers that would move everything I owned, everything I'd spent 40 years building, out of my hands and into my son-in-law's, and that it was nearly finished. A week away. I want to tell you what my body did in that flower bed, because I think people imagine you hear a thing like that and you react. I didn't react. I went completely still. My hand was flat against the brick, and I remember the brick was warm from the afternoon sun, and I remember a bee working the flowers by my knee, and I remember thinking, with a strange calm, do not move, do not make a sound, whatever you do not let them hear you. It was the same stillness I'd feel years ago waiting to see if a big contract was going to come through. That held breath quiet, where your whole life is balanced on the next 30 seconds, and you cannot afford to flinch. And underneath the stillness, something was breaking so quietly and so completely that I didn't even feel it fully until I was back in the car. 44 years. The mattress on the floor. The invoices she typed. All of it. Reorganizing itself in real time into a different story than the one I'd been living, and me standing perfectly still in a flower bed while it happened. And then I heard Corbin's voice, and he said something that told me the rest of it, the part about my daughter. He said, "And you're sure Junior won't?" And Delphine cut him off and said, "Junior's not going to know anything until it's over, and by then it won't matter. You'll have the assets, you file, and she's got nothing to fight you with. She'll land on her feet, she's young. You'll have the assets, you file. He was going to divorce my daughter. That was the plan. He and my wife were going to strip me of everything, put it all in Corbin's name, and then Corbin was going to divorce Junior and walk away with my entire life's work, and my daughter would get nothing, and I would be, what was the phrase, out on the road. My wife was helping the man who was going to destroy our daughter, for a cut, for money. I stood in that flower bed, 67 years old, and I did not make a sound. And I want to talk to you about that because it's the most important decision I made in this entire story, and it went against every single thing my body wanted to do. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to go through that window, to kick in that door, to confront them, right there, to see their faces, to scream at my wife, to grab Corbin by his collar. 44 years of marriage and my whole body wanted to burst into that room and blow the entire thing up in one glorious, furious, satisfying moment. And I didn't. And I'll tell you why, because I think it's the only useful thing I have to teach anybody. I spent 40 years in business, and in 40 years of business I learned one lesson more times than any other. The person who reacts loses, and the person who prepares wins. Every bad deal I ever got out of, I got out of by keeping my mouth shut and my eyes open. Every person who ever tried to cheat me, I beat by letting them think they were winning right up until the moment they weren't. And standing in that flower bed, some cold, old businessman part of my brain took over from the heartbroken husband, and it said, "If you go through that window right now, you get one moment of satisfaction, and then she knows you know. And the second she knows you know, she stops. She covers her tracks. She destroys the paperwork. And it becomes your word against hers, an old man's word against his wife's, and you have nothing, and she gets a lawyer, and this drags out for years, and Junior gets hurt in the crossfire, and maybe they even find a way to make it all stick anyway. But if you walk away right now, if you get back in your car and you drive home and you say nothing, and you let her keep believing you're exactly the old fool she thinks you are, then you have the one thing she doesn't know you have. You have warning. And a week. So that's what I did. I stood there just long enough to be sure of what I'd heard. And then I walked back to my car, quietly, and I drove home. And when Delphine came in that evening, home from her sister's, I asked her how Fen was doing, and she said, "Oh, you know Fen, same as always." And she made dinner, and we ate it. And I looked at that woman across the table, and I smiled, and I passed her the salt, and inside I had gone as cold and as clear as I have ever been in my life. That dinner was the strangest meal of my life, and I want to tell you about it, because I think it says something about what 40 years of self-control does to a man. She told me about her day at Fen's. She invented it, right there across the table, the drive, the lunch they'd had, some story about Fen's garden. And I sat there and I nodded and I asked follow-up questions, and every answer she gave me was a lie, and I knew it was a lie, and I kept my face as warm and as ordinary as it had been for 44 years. She never saw a flicker. I have thought since that this frightened me a little about myself, that I could sit there 3 hours after my heart had been taken out with a spoon and pass the potatoes and ask about a garden that didn't exist. But that's the thing they never understood about me, either of them. They thought the warmth was softness. The warmth was a choice. And a man who can choose the warmth can also, when he needs to, choose the cold. She thought she had a week. She thought I was an old fool. She had no idea that the old fool had heard every word, and that the old fool had spent 40 years learning exactly how to take a thing apart. The next morning, I did not go to work. I told Delphine I had a meeting with a client, and instead I got in my car and I drove to the office of the best attorney in the region for exactly this kind of thing, a woman named Odile Vanterpool, who does financial fraud and asset protection, and who came recommended by my own business lawyer with the words, "If somebody is stealing from you, she is who you want, and God help them." And I sat in Odile Vanterpool's office, and I told her everything I had heard through that window, and I watched her face change as I talked, from professional attention to something sharper, and when I finished, she was quiet for a second, and then she said, "Mr. Ashby, I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to do exactly what I tell you, in exactly the order I tell you, and if you do, they are going to lose. All of it. Do you understand?" And I said I understood. And before I left her office, she said one more thing that steadied me for the whole rest of it. She said, "Mr. Ashby, I've done this a long time, and I want to tell you something about people who do what your wife is doing. They are always, always overconfident. That's their weakness. She thinks it's done, she thinks she's clever. And that arrogance means she's gotten sloppy, and sloppy is exactly what we need. The worst person to catch stealing is a careful, frightened one. The easiest is one who's already celebrating." And she was right. Delphine had been so certain, for so long, that I would never catch on, that she'd stopped being careful years ago. She'd left a trail a mile wide, because why would you cover your tracks from a man you're sure is blind? And I said, I understood. And I want to walk you through exactly what we did over the next several days, because every single piece of it was legal and precise and quiet, and it is the reason this story ends the way it does. And I promise you, none of it involved me confronting anybody, or losing my temper, or tipping my hand. Not once. The first thing Odile did was hire a private investigator. Because here's the thing. I had heard what I heard, but my word alone was not enough. We needed proof. And within 48 hours, that investigator had begun to establish the truth. The pattern of Delphine's visits to Corbin, records of documents, a picture of what was actually happening. I'm not going to detail the investigator's methods because some of it I don't fully understand, and all of it was done properly and lawfully by professionals. But understand that within a few days we were no longer relying on my ears. We had a case being built on the record by people who do this for a living. The second thing we did, and this was the crucial one, the one that beat their clock, was move to protect the assets before the forgery could be completed. Remember, Delphine had told Corbin it was another week. That week was everything. So Odile moved fast. Now, I want to be precise about this because this is where these stories go stupid and I refuse to lie to you. I could not seize my wife's money. That's not a thing. And I wouldn't have wanted to. What I could do, what was entirely mine to do, was protect what was mine and shut down her access to it. The joint accounts, the ones she had access to and had been using to move things around, I had every legal right, as a joint owner, to freeze and to restructure. And we did, working with the bank's fraud department, who take forged signatures extremely seriously, let me tell you. Her access to those accounts ended. My business, the company I had built and owned, I moved to protect my shareholding and lock out any transfer of it. It was mine. It had my name on the founding documents. Whatever paperwork she thought she had forged, my attorney made certain that not one share of that company was going anywhere, and put protections in place that made it untouchable. I want to tell you one detail from those days, because it surprised me and it might help somebody watching. When my attorney and I sat down with the bank's fraud department and laid out what was happening, forged signatures on a joint account, an asset transfer in progress, they did not treat me like a confused old man, which is what I'd braced for. They moved fast, and they moved hard, because forgery on their instruments is their problem too, not just mine. Banks do not like being the vehicle for a fraud. The moment it was documented, I had an entire institution with far more power than I have working in the same direction I was, because it was in their interest as much as mine. I had spent that whole week feeling alone against two people who knew me inside out. It turned out I wasn't alone at all. I just had to make the right phone calls in the right order. My life insurance, the policy she'd been forging signatures on to change, we contacted the insurer directly, flagged the fraud, and locked it down completely. Any changes she'd attempted were frozen pending investigation. And here's the beautiful part, the part that still makes me shake my head. All of this, freezing the accounts, protecting the shares, locking the insurance, all of it happened quietly, on the back end, through banks and lawyers and paperwork. Delphine had no idea any of it was happening. She was still walking around our house believing that in a few days everything was going to transfer into Corbin's name. She was, that whole week, still an old fool's wife, sitting on a plan that had already been dismantled underneath her without her feeling a thing. The third thing, and this was the one that mattered most to me as a father, was Junia. Because everything up to that point was about protecting my money. But there was a young woman about to be blindsided, my daughter, who had no idea that her husband and her mother were about to destroy her life. And I was not going to let that happen to my girl. So, once the protections were in place, once it was too late for anyone to cover their tracks, Odile and I put together everything. The investigators' findings, the documentation of the forgery attempts, the full picture of what Corbin and Delphine had been planning, including the part where Corbin was going to divorce her and leave her with nothing. And I called my daughter, and I asked her to meet me, alone, for lunch. And that was the hardest hour of the entire thing. Harder than the window. Because I had to sit across from my child and tell her that her mother and her husband had been conspiring, for money, and that her husband had been planning to leave her, and that the two people she was supposed to be able to trust had been planning her ruin at a kitchen table, while she was at work teaching other people's children. I watched my daughter's face while I told her. I watched it the way you watch something break. And then I did the only thing I could do, which was slide the folder across the table and let her see it with her own eyes, because a thing like that you cannot ask someone to take on faith. She read it, in a restaurant quietly with her hands shaking, and when she finished, she looked up at me and I will never forget what she said. She said, "How long have you known?" And I said, 9 days. And she said, "And you spent those 9 days protecting me?" And I said, "You're my daughter. That's the whole job. That was always the whole job." And then my girl put her head down on that restaurant table and cried, and I moved my chair around next to hers, and I put my arm around her, and I did not say another word because there wasn't one that would help. Some things you just have to sit next to a person while they feel. Now, let me tell you how it came down. Because it came down all at once, and it came down exactly the way Odile had planned it. And I would be lying if I told you it wasn't satisfying, because it was the most satisfying thing I've ever watched in my life. We let them keep believing. That was the strategy. Right up until the end, Delphine thought her plan was days from completion, and Corbin thought he was about to become a wealthy man and shed my daughter like an old coat. We let them keep thinking it, while everything was already locked down and my daughter already knew everything. And then, on a single day, it all arrived. Corbin went to execute the final piece of their plan, to access what he thought was about to be his, and found that every door was locked, the accounts frozen, the business shares protected and untransferable, the insurance flagged for fraud. Everything he and Delphine had spent months forging their way toward was simply gone, walled off, out of reach, and he could not understand how, because as far as he knew, no one had any idea. And on that same day, Corbin Vale was served with divorce papers by my daughter, who had gotten her own attorney, a very good one, the moment she left that restaurant, and who had spent the intervening days calmly preparing to end her marriage on her own terms, with full knowledge of exactly what her husband was, and with all the evidence in hand. He got the bank's notices and my daughter's divorce filing in the same window of days. And I am told, because I was not there, and I did not need to be there, I was long past needing to see his face, I am told that Corbin Vale completely came apart, because he had played a very careful game, and he had been absolutely certain he was winning, right up until the second he discovered he had already lost everything weeks before, and never even knew it was happening. He had nothing. That's the thing. He'd bet his entire life, and betrayed his wife, and conspired with his mother-in-law, and at the end of it he had no assets, because they were never going to be his, and no marriage, because my daughter had thrown him out, and no case, because everything he'd done was fraud, and it was all documented. He walked away from a decade of my daughter's life with exactly zero, which is precisely what he had been planning to leave her with. And Delphine. I saved her for last, because that's the one that actually mattered, and it's the one that still hurts. I did not scream at my wife. After everything, I never did give her the satisfaction of a scene, and I never gave myself one either, because I'd learned by then that a scene is a gift you give the other person, a way to make it feel mutual, and I did not want it to feel mutual. I wanted it to feel exactly like what it was. What happened was that Delphine woke up one morning to find that her access to the accounts was gone, and her son-in-law was calling her in a panic, and her whole plan had collapsed into dust, and she could not for the life of her understand how. And she came to me, because I was still, she thought, the old fool who didn't know anything. And she started to spin some story about a problem with the bank, and I let her get about 2 sentences into it. And then I said, very quietly, the only hard thing I ever said to her directly. I said, Delphine, I was standing outside Corbin's window. I heard you call me an old fool. I heard all of it. I've heard all of it for 3 weeks. It's over. And I watched 44 years fall off of that woman's face. I watched her understand that the entire time she thought she'd been playing me, I had been the one who was 3 moves ahead. And she didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. She just sat down at our kitchen table in the house I'd paid for, and she put her hand over her mouth. She did try, once a few days later, to explain herself. She came to me and she said it wasn't what it sounded like, that Corbin had pressured her, that she'd gotten in over her head, that she'd always meant to make sure I was taken care of, and I listened to the whole thing, all the way through, without interrupting. The same way I'd listened to her lie about her sister's garden. And when she finished, I asked her one question. I said, when you called me an old fool and laughed, was Corbin pressuring you to laugh? And she didn't have an answer for that. Because there isn't one. You can be pressured into a scheme. You cannot be pressured into delight. The laugh was hers. The laugh was the truest thing I heard through that window, and we both knew it. And I got up and I left the room, because I had nothing left to say to her, and I have very little left to say to her to this day. Now, the honest rest of it, because these stories always want to end at the moment of victory, and life is what happens afterward, and I told you I'd give it to you straight. Delphine and I are divorced now. It was finalized a few months ago, and here's a thing I did not expect. The divorce itself was not the hard part. The hard part was long over. The hard part was that flower bed. By the time the lawyers were dividing things up, I had already grieved my marriage, standing in the dark, listening to her laugh, and there was nothing left to fight about that I hadn't already lost. She did not get my business. She did not get my life's work. Because of the timing, and because of what she had attempted, she left that marriage with far, far less than she would have gotten if she had simply stayed honest and let it end like a decent person. Which is a bitter kind of irony I've thought about a lot. If Delphine had just come to me after 44 years and said, "Rowan, I'm done. I want out," I'd have given her half of everything without a fight, because that would have been fair, and I am, whatever else, a fair man. Instead, she tried to take all of it by fraud, and she got caught, and she ended up with a fraction. Greed is expensive. It cost her the very thing she was greedy for. I keep the house, I keep the business, which I've since put into a proper structure that goes to Junia and to Junia alone, the way it was always meant to. And I keep my life insurance, which I've redone, and which now names the one person on this earth who never betrayed me. Corbin is gone. Out of my daughter's life entirely. Last I heard, he'd left the area. I don't spend any time thinking about him. He was a small man with a big plan, and he ended up with nothing. And that's the whole story of Corbin Vale. And Junia. My daughter is doing well. Better than well. It was a terrible year for her. I won't pretend it wasn't. Discovering your husband and your mother in one afternoon is a wound that doesn't close overnight. But she is strong, my girl. Stronger than she knew, and she has come through it. And she is more herself now than she's been in years, because it turns out she'd been shrinking herself around Corbin for a decade without either of us fully seeing it. She went back to school, my Junia, got a certification she'd wanted for years, and let go of somewhere in the Corbin years because he'd made her feel it wasn't worth the money or the time. She's got a better position now, one she earned entirely herself, and the first time she told me about it, over one of our Sunday dinners, she had a light in her face I realized I hadn't seen since her wedding day, and it broke my heart a little to understand how long it had been dimmed. She said to me once carefully, "Dad, is it strange that I'm almost grateful it happened? Because I don't think I'd have ever left on my own. I think I'd have shrunk down to nothing and called it a marriage." And I told her no, it wasn't strange, that I understood it better than she knew, because I'd have done the same with her mother. Stayed and shrunk and called a lie a life, right up until the day I died, if I hadn't turned onto the wrong street. She and I have dinner every Sunday, the two of us now, and it's the best part of my week. We don't talk about her mother much. We don't need to. Some things you just carry quietly, side by side, and that's its own kind of comfort. Here's the thing I keep coming back to, and then I'll let you go. My wife stood in another man's living room and called me an old fool, and she was so certain of it that she laughed. And the thing is, she wasn't entirely wrong. I had been a fool. For years, I'd been a fool. I'd sat at my own dinner table and watched my wife and my son-in-law grow close, and I'd felt lucky about it. I'd trusted two people who were, the whole time, taking my measure and finding me easy. That part is true, and I've had to make my peace with it because a man who can't admit when he's been played never learns anything. But here's what she got wrong, and it's the only thing that ended up mattering. She thought being a fool and being a pushover were the same thing. They're not. I had been slow to see it, that's true, but the day I finally saw it, I was not slow at all. I was 40 years of hard-won instinct, moving quietly, 3 steps ahead of the both of them, and by the time they even knew the game was over, they'd already lost every single piece. They thought they were going to walk away with my entire life's savings, every dollar of it, 40 years of work. They walked away with nothing. He lost his marriage and his scheme. She lost her marriage and her share, and I kept every single thing they tried to take, and I gave it to the one person it was always meant for. The only thing I actually lost was a marriage that, it turned out, I'd lost a long time ago and just hadn't been told yet. And I'll tell you, I'd make that trade again in a heartbeat. Better to lose a lie you were living than to keep it. So let me ask you something, and I do read these. Have you ever gotten a warning you weren't supposed to get, overheard something, saw something, found something out by accident that changed everything because it gave you time to protect yourself? What did you do with it? I'd genuinely like to hear, because that one accidental turn onto the wrong street is the only reason I'm not out on the road right now. And here's the harder one, and I ask it honestly. Have you ever had to choose between the satisfaction of blowing up at someone in the moment and the patience of beating them quietly later? Which did you choose, and would you choose it again? Because I chose the quiet way, and it cost me the scream I wanted so badly, and I still don't know some nights whether I'm at peace with that or not. Tell me where you land. That's all I've got tonight. If it meant something to you, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you at the next one.